So before this conference can come to an end, we have to present you another highlight. And I'm again not sure if I really need to introduce this guy who will enter the stage in a minute. Actually, in the community, he's known as the Dark Tangent, and maybe you want to share the story behind this with you. He's the founder of both Black Hat and DEFCON conference, and he's also the former chief security officer and vice president of ICANN. He sits in several security advisory boards. Who am I talking about? Ladies and gentlemen, Jeff Moss.
The Dark Tangent question. Yeah. I think Dark Tangent came about, for those of you who know the history of hacking handles, you get really invested in these alternative identities where in the early days of the internet, you're underage, you can't drive a car, you can't vote, you can't drink, you can't do anything. But you can be online talking to people all over the world. And when I was 14, I was online talking to people in Russia and learning about sex and drugs and rock and roll. All the things, all the conversations you can't have with your parents, I was having online. And it was really liberating because nobody knew how old I was. Nobody knew my gender. Nobody knew anything about me. It was only what came out of my fingers. I was judged purely on how I presented myself online. And for a teenager in California, that was really liberating. And so then what happens is you have all this goodwill tied up in your handle. And my handle, before Dark Tangent, was another one. And when you make a mistake, I inevitably made a mistake, and I had to burn that identity. And so I got a do-over. I created a new identity. Nowadays, with these true name policies on Facebook and whatever, kids today don't get do-overs, right? Data is forever today. Like, you're never going to find what I said 30 years ago. It's gone. But today, data is forever, right? Every one of your children, if they ever want to go into politics, everything they ever do is available. And so I kind of come from this era where data was expensive. And because of that, I got a free ride and I got a do-over. Today, no do-overs. So it's a different era. But anyway, I've got a couple ideas I want to talk to you about. Some of them are kind of thought through and some of them are half-baked. So I'm going to turn to you to help me finish baking these ideas. And the first idea is really this trajectory. I've been speaking about it on and off for a couple of years, this trajectory of complexity. So if you look at human history, we were agrarian and hunter-gatherers, or hunter-gatherers and agrarian, and then we industrialized. Now we're in this information age, and everything about our careers, I'm going to bet everything about your careers is based on specialization. Right? You stand out in your area of expertise by specializing. It's very hard to stand out any career today by being a generalist, right? So we're all specializing. And when we specialize, we kind of lose the big perspective. I come from the era of being sort of a generalist, but a lot of my colleagues now that are really successful, they're very specialized. And so you can't have really broad conversations with them very easily. But they can't have very super specialized conversations with me. So what I'm wondering about then is where this leads us. The velocity of specialization is increasing, and I think that leads to an increase in complexity. And there's a complexity theory which talks about failure modes. And the failure modes of complex systems are mathematically impossible to predict. And so we're building our societies on these complex systems that are becoming more complex. At the same time, we're losing generalists and we're specializing. So if anything is to go wrong, who can see the big picture? Who can describe the big picture to policymakers, to the CEOs, to the executives? I'm really kind of concerned where this takes us. As a counter to that, you find companies simplifying. So for example, you can't protect everything. It's not possible. So it becomes really critical for you to understand what is the most important asset of your company. And if, just from the way I've started this conversation, you've probably caught on that I'm not a military guy. right? I'm a civil society, I'm a commercial, I'm a multi-stakeholder model kind of guy. You know, in U.S. government, I'm on the advisory committee for Department of Homeland Security. Homeland Security is a lot like ICANN, is a lot like all the security conferences, is a lot like civil society. It's from the bottom up, right? It's not a military sort of top-down. And so all my experiences is pretty much from the bottom up. And what I find in these conversations is that our language really informs our thought. So when I'm talking to you and you start using language like digital bullets and digital cyber kill chains and boots on the ground, I start getting really kind of concerned, because if you're going to have a digital kill chain and you're going to have a digital weapon, you start thinking in the language in the terms of war, cyber high ground, and it leads you into certain ways of thinking, adversaries, us, them. When if you look at the history of cyber, it's almost more like a language of pathology or medical terminology, viruses, infections, inoculation. And so the majority of the people who build the networks, that own the networks, that operate the networks, they think of this more of a sort of pathology way. And then you talk to people in the military, and they think of this as in a very command and control way. And sometimes we talk right past each other. And so I just want you to think, as a takeaway, think about how you use language. And are you helping or are you hurting the conversation? So for example, you talk about digital bullets. And cyber is, we're in such a tough situation because none of our analogies really work. So we're constantly trying to invent new analogies to try to describe the situation. But say digital bullets. Okay, describe to me a bullet where if you shoot me, at me, and I catch the bullet like Superman, I look at the bullet, and then I can shoot it right back at you, right? And now your bullet no longer works against me, and I can use it against your whole population. Right? That doesn't sound like a bullet to me. That's not a good analogy. But that's essentially what we're talking about. Right? You use your 0 day against me. If I'm good, I capture your 0 day, I understand it, and I turn around and I use it right back on your population. Because by necessity, you kept that 0 day from your own population and your own industrial base. They are just as vulnerable as I am. And by you using the weapon against me, I get to use it against you. And that doesn't sound like a bullet. So your analogies, can get you in some really tough situations when you're trying to describe them to policymakers. The other thing I really get frustrated about a little bit is this cyber is the fifth domain. Okay, I understand it. You've got air, land, sea, and space, and you fight wars in these areas. But the problem is if I shoot down your airplane and it crashes into the ground, the air is still the air. Right? I sink your boat, the sea is still the sea. But if you start duking it out in cyberspace, I can guarantee you cyberspace will change right underneath your feet. Right? T-Mobile, Verizon, Comcast, they see a battle going on in their networks. It's in their economic interests to fix the network. They're going to kick you out. Are you going to call up AT&T and say, hi, this is US military, let us beat up your network? No. Right? Chinese aren't going to call you up and ask permission to beat up on your network. So if you start duking it out on the internet, don't be surprised if the internet fundamentally changes. And the long-term consequences of that are, how many wars do you think you get to fight on the internet? Until the internet is fundamentally different and broken from what it was today. Right? Do we get to fight 2 wars, and then the internet is busted for all of our children? So the decisions we make today are going to impact the internet for the next 20 years. And when people start talking about fighting in the fifth domain, I start getting concerned, because it might be the fifth domain, but you might wake up one day and it's not anything like what you remember it to be. We have to destroy the internet to save it. It's concerning. And then I like to talk about actors, the people that we kind of come across in this area. And I pick 4 as sort of the arbitrary number, but I say there's nation states that are big actors, and they're mostly since we haven't seen a cyber war yet, they're mostly involved in covert operations. They're generally after secrets. Secrets to verify what their diplomats say, secrets to find out if the other country's stealing their industrial secrets. but they're in the secrets game. Organized criminals are in the money game, right? Secrets are not very fungible. I think criminal organizations would rather have credit card dumps than this formula for Coca-Cola. You can't monetize that very easily. And the interesting thing is nation states have printing presses. They're not interested in money, right? So the two are sort of mutually exclusive. You've got protesters, I call them activists. They want a lot of attention, and they're not beyond using exploits to draw attention to their cause. They're not beyond giant denial of service attacks, wrecking everybody between them and their target on the internet, secondary damage, collateral damage, but to draw attention to their cause. And then finally, you have academics, researchers, hackers, sort of this fourth group that are active. The interesting thing is, all of these groups need the internet to operate. You can't steal secrets if the net's down, right? You can't steal money if the net's down. You can't draw attention to your cause if the net's down. So here we are with a pretty fragile internet where all the actors need the internet to function. So what I get concerned about is, well, imagine it this way. Imagine if 3 of the 4 groups needed the internet to function and a 4th group didn't. Our internet would be fundamentally much more resilient, right? Think about how fragile it is today when essentially everybody is aligned in their interests. So I am concerned about, and I've said this for a couple years, is there a 5th group that doesn't need the internet to function? If there is, what would that group look like? To whose advantage would it be to not have the internet function? And that's the boogeyman. Nobody can come up with a good example for me. Nobody can convince me that there really is a 5th group that whole purpose in life is to destroy the internet. And I want to be convinced because it would justify a lot of spend, but nobody can come up with that example for me. And I want to focus on the 4th group, hackers and researchers and academics. Because really, if you think about it, who's telling you right now what the vulnerabilities are? Who's telling you what's really possible in an attack or defense scenario? Are the organized criminals telling you how they're stealing your money? No. Nation states, intelligence community telling you about their latest attacks? No. Are the companies telling you how vulnerable they are? No. So the only way any of us make informed decisions on our security policies, on our national policies, on anything, are because a security researcher or a hacker has told us about it, right? That is really fascinating because only one of those 4 groups is it in their interest to tell us what's really going on. It's sort of like, in the olden days, locksmiths. They would not tell the public how to attack a lock, a door lock. And it turns out there's a lot of really crappy locks out there. Did the locksmiths ever go to the public and warn them, hey, by the way, never buy that Schlage lock because it's terrible? No, they just kept letting this garbage be sold. And it wasn't until lockpickers and hackers started taking apart physical locks and pointing out, like, these things are really terrible. Only then did the manufacturers start changing their ways. So we've entered an era where we're more dependent on technology, and we have fewer people telling us the risks of that technology. And if you look at legislation that's coming down the line, it's going to become more and more risky for researchers to tell us. It'll be easier to stifle the researchers, right? That does not seem like a successful formula for winning. And if you look at organized criminals and intelligence communities, they're really almost the same, right? Who else has experience operating large-scale botnets? Intel, criminals. Who has experience running information operations campaigns, right? Deciding when to burn infrastructure, when to deploy new exploits, how to obfuscate exploits, how to exfil data, right? Organized crime and intel agencies. And it's not a normal behavior for companies to do this. There is no inbred knowledge base in any company on how to do these things because it's not a normal function, right? So we're starting to find ourselves in this really interesting scenario where normally, if you want to know what's going on, you talk to think tanks, you talk to private industry, maybe you talk to some researchers, and they tell you what's going on. We've entered an era now where the information operation capabilities of intel agencies that have been doing this for 10 years, organized crime groups that have been doing it for 10 years, they are so far ahead of the think tanks and the academics that sometimes when I go to conferences and I listen to the academics talk about these things, I'm like, oh my God, you are 5 years behind, right? You're 5 years behind and you think you're 3 years ahead. So organized criminals aren't going to tell us what's really going on, and IC is not going to tell us what's really going on. Where does the oversight come from, right? How does an open and transparent society have any clue what's going on in this area? It's all classified, and there's no natural knowledge base in the private industry, right? We've entered a new era. There's not been another era kind of like that before. And so I find that really interesting, right? It's sort of the first time when academia is not, I mean, they think about these things, but they're not doing it. They have no hands-on experience. And so this leads me back to the better you understand the risks, the better informed decisions you can make. And you find this all the time. You find people who don't know how to attack systems sit around and cook up these awesome defenses, really elaborate defenses, because they've never been an attacker. They can only fantasize what an attacker is doing, and then they construct their idealized defense. So instead of getting a realistic defense, you get some really, and then an attacker comes along and looks at it, and they're like, what are you doing? It's just that there's such a limited resource of attackers out there that can, and half of them are classified. And the other thing is, the speed of risk is accelerating. So we're now assuming new risks that we don't know we're assuming at a faster pace because of complexity and velocity. And so who is going to help you understand them? Who is going to help your organization or your government understand what new risks you're assuming? It's not in the interests of any of the star players to reveal their capabilities. So how do you make an informed decision? It's a conundrum, right? There's a saying from the NSA that attacks always get better. They never get worse. So if you're having a hard time today, sorry, it's only going to get worse, right? How are you going to defend in that world? Right? The NSA has another saying, right? Automate everything you can automate, and then automate everything else. Because you will not win a one-on-one war with your opponent. They'll have too many people, right? Really, you're going to go one-on-one with China? Good luck with that, you know? And if you look at what the trends are, my role at ICANN, I was really concerned about denial of service attacks because it was one of the 2 ways to take down the internet. And so I would track how big is the current largest denial of service attack. Is it large enough to be a threat to the root server system? And you would see them getting larger and larger. So I have some numbers. I think like in April of 2013, there was a giant ramp attack that was about 300 megabits. By February 2014, it was about 400 megabits with an NTP attack. I've heard of, but it hasn't been attributed publicly, there was an attack about 525 gigabits. When I was at ICANN, I was tracking a threat actor who had over a terabit of flow traffic at his disposal. Right? What are you going to do with a terabit when it's coming at you? And so this is my scenario to you. If actor, could be a government, could be a criminal organization, extortion, drops a terabit down on some of your businesses in your company and effectively drops them off the internet, it becomes a financial attack in the sense that you can stay up if you can afford to pay the content distribution networks or the anti-DDoS companies. But you can drop $40,000 a day defending yourself, buying bandwidth. And sooner or later, you're going out of money. You're going to run out of money. So in that case, what is the role of government? If the small to medium business gets dropped offline because of a denial of service attack and that company effectively goes out of business, people lose their jobs, what is the role of government in that scenario? How long do you think the United States government would let its small to medium businesses go offline before it decides to do something? And what would it do? Right? We can see this coming. So there was a great study of the state of the internet, 2014 versus 2013. How has denial of service attacks grown? And they're up 90% between 13 and 14. There's a 52% increase in bandwidth, and they're doing it with 77% less packets. So the bad guys are using 77% less traffic, and they're generating 90% more. So the bad guys are getting smarter. So I'll give you another scenario here. This nation-state response. China versus GitHub in the United States. How many people are familiar with that? Happened, last month. Fascinating. China doesn't block GitHub because there's so much programming and other projects on there. They let GitHub in. So the people at Great Fire, which publish firewall circumvention technologies, and the cn.newyorktimes.com host GitHub repositories. So if you want in China, you can go read the New York Times, the China articles, and you can learn how to circumvent the Great Firewall. Well, China doesn't like that. So what they effectively did is took their Great Firewall of China, and instead of using it as a blocking mechanism, uses it as a dynamic man-in-the-middle tool to rewrite traffic from people coming from outside China in, rewrote it, and when the response came back out of China, it instructed the end users to attack GitHub. This is a brilliant attack from China for a couple of reasons. One, normal civil remedies don't work, right? In a normal civil system, we would have an acceptable use policy. We would have peering agreements. We would have service level agreements. We would have 3 or 4 mechanisms by which we would just de-peer China if we had to. If they were doing the denial of service, it would be violating all these service agreements, we would just de-peer them. But by forcing end users to attack from wherever they were, they've completely circumvented normal civil society remedies. Civil law is not really going to work now. Now what do? Our only backup is government. Right? Now we're into nation-state responses. And what was America's response? Nothing. Right? So they effectively let China use their Great Firewall to try to take down a giant company, a large provider in the States, and they didn't do a thing. They didn't say anything about it publicly. So what kind of signal does that send to China, right? They've got their new technique perfected that gets around normal remedies. Targeted country doesn't say a thing. Do not be surprised when this comes to a theater near you. It's just the way it's going to be. And this leads me to one of my other thoughts from the Atlantic Council. We did a paper, Jay Healy, on what is the equivalent of cyber too big to fail, right? A systemic risk that we're growing in the cyberspace that's maybe too big to fail. So imagine that Amazon AWS Cloud goes out of business. Construct a scenario. It's gone. AWS is gone. Is that too big to fail? Is AWS critical infrastructure? Would we prop them up and keep them running? Right? What other too big to fails are we growing? Or what other concentrations of risk are we building? Right? If you drop a bomb on a data center and that data center stops functioning, what are the follow-on effects, right? The physical, kinetic, electronic effects. I don't think people have really thought this through. What is the threshold of government involvement? Okay, GitHub has a lot of money, they have a lot of bandwidth. The attack lasted a week, but it only bumped them offline for 2 hours. Is that sort of a no harm, no foul? Government can look the other way? What if they went out of business, right? What if they turned to the government and cried for help? Would the government have an affirmative duty to respond, right? What if it was a criminal extortion attack from a criminal instead of a nation state? Is that more politically acceptable to respond against the criminal and maybe not the government? And so I feel that this is leading us to an era of what I'm kind of calling the brittle internet. Right? We're having a more complex internet. We're adding all these Internet of Things to the internet. And we're making conscious decisions to make the internet more brittle. And we're doing this as a trade-off for more security. So, for example, for the techies in the audience, the internet used to be really flexible. Right? There was this concept of source address routing and ICMP redirects, where if a link was down, you could manually decide how to route your packet around problems. It was much more dynamic. But bad guys use that routing, that dynamic routing, to route packets toward attackers, to spoof source addresses, to do a Smurf attack. So we started blocking ICMP redirects. Then we stopped, accepting source routing. And every time we do something like that, we fixate the internet a little bit more and a little bit more, and it becomes a little bit more calcified. And then we do things like deploy DNSSEC, which gives us great security advantages. But it's complicated. Sometimes it's hard to manage. And when it fails, it's not pretty. But we've decided as an engineering community that we're going to accept more fragility and more brutality, I guess, in return for the security gains. And in the future, we're looking at secure BGP routing potentially. Okay, that's also going to be really scary and brittle. So at the time where we're talking more about the sort of the concentration of these too big to fail effects, at the same time, we're making the internet more fragile. And I just want everybody to understand, with both eyes open, you are assuming that risk. Do you understand? You have assumed that risk, whether you know it or not. And you need to take that into account in your decision making. So I just want to talk briefly. What, I have no minutes left? I have no minutes left. Okay, I'll just say that some of these problems, I think, are coming from a sort of a tragedy of the commons approach, where there is nobody necessarily in charge, and so therefore it is nobody's problem. And you can look at this. Why is it hard to send email securely? Why can't you send email securely? Why can't you have a secure cell phone conversation? Why aren't your text messages secure by default? Why can't you browse the internet securely by default, right? Well, it's because it turns out there's no one person in charge. IETF created standards, kind of went into the community cloud, and nobody wants to spend the money on that one thing. Instead, they'll invent 50 other products to solve the case, but they won't solve it in the general community. And so if you look at a lot of our problems, they're what's referred to by, who is the author of The Tragedy of the Commons, Garrett Hardin. It's called a problem is called a social dilemma. And a lot of us are living with these social dilemmas in our networks, and there's no clear answers on who is in charge. So it turns into an IETF problem, an ICANN problem. It's not a Microsoft problem. And I want to just, one last thing I want to leave you with is, what will change any of this? What fundamentally will move the needle? And this is sort of my controversial statement. It is, if we ever can abolish the software shrink wrap license, right? There is no liability in the software licenses. That is mind-boggling, right? In every aspect of our life, in every other area of law, there's liability, except in software, right? Elon Musk builds a Tesla, he fills it full of computers and a mobile data center, and because it's a car, he has liability. Airbus and Boeing build flying data centers, they've got liability. Oracle installs a fixed data center, no liability. How long can that last? That Oracle database has my data in it. It has your tax records. It has everything else. But for some reason, there's no liability there, right? So I think the world we're quickly rushing to is a world where governments are getting more involved, and I'm guaranteeing you there's going to be a liability and there's going to be cyber insurance. And that's the world we're going to have to live in. Okay, so I'd love to keep talking. I just skipped over like 10 slides, but I want to thank you for listening to me, and I'd really like to talk with you about some of these ideas, because I think in this mixed environment, we can probably get some pretty creative solutions. So thank you for having me.
Yep. Thank you, Jeff. So the floor is open for questions. There is the first one from Paul. Please always state your name and affiliation, please.
Paul Vixie, Farsight Security. Jeff, thank you for these remarks. They dovetail with some of my closing remarks yesterday, where I noted that one of the big purposes of nations used to be to keep its citizens safe from attacks by foreign agents or even domestic criminals. Since that works well in a kinetic world, but not well in what we're now calling the cyber world, I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts about the proper role of a truly democratically elected government of a truly free country in keeping its citizens safe from cyber attacks, foreign and domestic? Thank you.
Yes, so I'm a big believer in trying to mandate outcomes and not methods. And I think if you give a company the opportunity to transfer risk to the government, they'll take it. Right? So if all of a sudden it's the US government's job to protect the database of Oracle, Oracle would love it. They'll take that in a heartbeat. And so I think it's really, you have to be really cautious about anything that's going to take the burden, and the government's going to assume the burden for malfeasance from a company or incompetence, or now it's no longer their problem. And you see some of this debate around the Wassenaar Agreement, the export controls around 0 days and digital weapons, and people are saying things like, that's great, I no longer have to worry about 0 days, because now they're going to be outlawed. It's like, well, okay, no, the researchers and the academics won't really be presenting them publicly, but you have the same problem with the organized criminals in the IC. And so I think in a democratic, open, transparent society, I think the government needs to set the standards. I really wish that our civil society was more sophisticated. So normally what happens, you're a company and you have a problem, you turn to your lawyers and say, that guy's trying to extort me, go get him, lawyers. And lawyers deploy and they sue everybody, right? That's your army, right? In the corporate sense, who are my fighters? They're my lawyers, right? And so in today's world, when something goes wrong and I turn to my shock troops, my lawyers, and I say, go get them, and they say, I don't have any tools. I don't have any armor. I don't have any weapons. I can't do anything. Call the FBI. Well, now it's a criminal matter, and you don't control criminal matters, right? That's an issue between the state. So companies don't like getting into criminal matters. And one of my wishes was that, let me ask you this, why can I donate money to Doctors Without Borders? Why can I donate money to get cats neutered and spayed, but I cannot donate money to make life hard on cyber criminals? Where can I give 10 euros to a group of professional lawyers that's only job is to fuck with criminals? Right? Why does that not exist? Why can I donate money to everything else but making life hard on criminals? That tells me there's a massive deficiency in civil society, in civil law. And so I think if we're going to get a big gain here in a transparent, democratic society, we need civil law to be there. Why are we depending on Microsoft to offer bounties on botnet operators? Hey, I'm fine with that. Go Microsoft. Why is that one company on the planet? Where are the 50 companies in Europe doing that? Where are the 30 companies in North America doing that? Why is it only Microsoft trying to clean up the internet? Right? There is something wrong there. And I really think if we're going to be successful as a society dealing with this, we need to fill the gap, because the answer is not going to be a military one. I hate to tell you, right? If we're calling in on the military to solve this, we've already lost. Right? We need civil remedies, and they are lacking. But I don't feel passionate about that or anything. Any other questions?
Question? It's hard to see from me. Here on the left side, please.
Kim Sitter with Wired. I was wondering, you talked about the necessity of researchers and hackers to notify us about the vulnerabilities in systems. Mm-hmm. And the security community, at least the antivirus community, has sort of been dogged by this rumor for many years that they somehow subvert their own antivirus software when it comes to nation state, to sort of look the other way, right, if they detect something from NSA or something like that. And what we saw with Stuxnet in particular was sort of the beginning of the politicization of security research. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you see that this is going to be a trend or a problem in the future with regard to security researchers, maybe even self-censoring if not being told to look the other way on something?
Well, you're giving tools of control to the governments to intimidate or stifle the security research, right? Through the DMCA, the Wassenaar Agreement, whatever it is. There are plenty of avenues for researchers to sell their vulnerabilities, right? There's underground markets, there's all kinds of opportunities. And instead of focusing on how do you make it really easy and friction-free for researchers to share, sort of liability-free, sort of for a greater good. If you meet certain criteria, it's clear it's for the greater good, you're not causing harm, you should get some sort of almost liability shield. And instead, it's the opposite. We find security researchers being threatened with legal action just mentioning that they found a bug in a certain security, in a certain commercial product. And I just get concerned. Germany has a law where I don't think it's ever been enforced, but you can't have certain security tools. UK has one of these laws. How does the security researcher do work? So now you're up to just the whims of the government deciding of whether or not you can legitimately have the tool. That sounds kind of stifling. And I don't want good intentions with these laws to actually drive people underground. So.
Alex Thunberg, Harvard. I wanted to come back to the point about the internet becoming more brittle.
Yeah.
So what's your solution? How does it become more resilient? Do diversity in products and approaches make it more resilient, or does it make it more failure prone? And do we want to avoid doubling down on certain systems like BGP and DNS, or do we want to have those systems simply made more resilient themselves?
Yeah.
What's the solution?
Yeah, so good question. I think we have, and Paul has been involved in all these conversations. He's much closer to it than I am. But I think we have made this trade-off, right? We've decided security over sort of resiliency in certain areas because the security gain is so great. So, but just because you get that great security gain, you find DNS operators who operate completely different technology paths. They'll run Cisco and HP on one side and Juniper and, I don't know, somebody else on the other side. And so, yes, you can have a lot of infrastructure resiliency, even though you're essentially running a brittle technology. And what I find is companies don't really think this through. They are just assuming the risk in a lot of these areas. They don't understand what they've outsourced. They don't understand the technology that they're running. And the few companies that I've found that really do understand this, so for example, like Amazon, right? They have looked at their huge infrastructure and they've decided we can't protect it all. Just, you'll go broke. So therefore, what must we protect? What can we simplify so that if something goes wrong, one person's mind can comprehend the system? I don't need to have a committee with 30 people. Like, it is knowable by a minimum number of people, and therefore it's describable and we can approach it. And so the credit card system, right? So I think we really need to understand what are our golden eggs? What must you protect, and everything else is tertiary, right? Sort of like, what can you jettison, what can you not? And so if you're going to add this brittleness, you need to understand the brittleness and have a plan to deal with it. So just don't assume the risk, I guess, is what I'm saying.
During this conference. Yeah.
There's one more, and then.
Jan Priso, senior fellow of the CCDCOE. And military culture has its own strength, not like building the capacities that you need very rarely and doing it very systematically. But what do you think actually, where this military culture fits in building the internet and protecting the internet? Does it have the place?
The question is, what does the military...
What is the military role in protecting this internet?
Military role in protecting the internet? Well, I think it's pretty much a traditional role in ensuring the sovereignty of borders. It's acting as sort of a final backstop if the civil process breaks down. And I think the military now has all the expertise in offensive capabilities. And so I think it would be really useful if we could learn from that on the defensive side. I get concerned that they're accelerating their skills out in their own bubble and we're not learning from it. And so it's making us really hard to have informed decisions and to design systems. So it's funny, like, for example, security researchers knew that you could hide rootkits in hard drive BIOS for 15 years. Yeah, of course you can do that. There's a controller on that hard drive. And then it turns out through the Snowden leaks that, guess what? People are hiding rootkits in hard drive controllers. Big shocker. But now all of a sudden the hard drive manufacturers are freaking out because they are the ones that are enabling persistent access by foreign nation states. Where were they for 20 years? Why do the hard drive manufacturers get a pass when everybody else knows it's possible? and they get to be oblivious. And they are the enablers of my insecurity, right? And I think had some arm of the government come forward and said, you know, by the way, hard drive manufacturers, video card manufacturers, you're enabling everybody to break into our country. Can you please do something to protect against it? But instead, they stayed silent, and everybody is vulnerable. And I'm just saying that I don't think staying quiet is a viable option in the future because so much now is at risk. More is at risk every day. And if you think about it, in the past, I had physical mechanisms. If you're old enough, you'll remember this. I had a jumper, a physical jumper on my motherboard that I had to set to allow my motherboard to be reprogrammed. You cannot buy a motherboard today with a physical jumper to protect you, right? You used to be able to buy a hard drive. That was standard, SCSI hard drive. You put a jumper on it to hardware right protect your hard drive. It physically is protected by physics. You cannot buy a hard drive today protected by physics. So we're building infrastructure that is less and less secure, and we're putting more and more stuff on it. And I think government that knows this has a role to play to set standards and procurement standards and purchasing agreements. But they're MIA. They're not at the table. And I'm a little pissed about that.
Jeff,
yeah.
As a final question, I would like to ask you the question I already asked in the future cyberspace session. What do you think cyberspace will be in 10 years, or how should it be? And what can all we do to make the world, to make cyberspace a better place?
Yeah, 10 years from now, I think they say, IBM did a study and they say 90% of all the world's data was created in the last 24 months. 10 years from now, it'll be created in the last couple of months. Hard drives are not growing as fast as data. We're going to come into a situation where you physically cannot move the data to where you need it, so you have to move the compute to the data, right? Your data centers in Europe, you will go broke trying to move that data across the Atlantic into America to work on it. So you have to work on it where the data is. These giant farms of hard drives where we keep all this data, and this P2P data, this Internet of Things data, machine-to-machine data, it's going to be like a giant anchor, and you just can't move that data 10 years from now. There'll be just too much of it.
Okay. Jeff, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And also for you.
Oh, fantastic.
Our speaker gift.
Excellent.
Yeah. Actually, we have a lot of comments about this on our Twitter as well. You may add your interpretation of our speaker gift as well to Twitter. I would really love to see your interpretation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.